I figured I'd make a video all about underrated metal albums, but before I get into that discussion, I want to address exactly what I consider to be an underrated album. Before making this video, I watched a handful of other individuals who all made their own videos all about what they consider to be underrated albums. And for the most part, I feel like they all kind of missed the mark of what an underrated album actually is, as most of their picks all had to do with all these obscure and lesser known name bands that no one really talks about, and I think there's a big difference between an obscure album and an underrated album. For example, I think The Chasm, Xenomorph, and Lakatha of Flame, within the realms of death metal, have all made some excellent releases. However, I wouldn't necessarily say they're underrated. They're just more obscure. Not many people know of them, but the people that do know of them talk very highly of them. So there's nothing really underrated about them other than they're just like obscure. Whereas when it comes to an actual underrated album, I've always looked at it that it's mainly done by well-established bands that a lot of people know, but they're often criticized in a negative way, or they're swept under the rug because some of the more successful and fan favorite releases within their discographies vastly overshadows it. With that now all addressed, I can finally dive into what I consider to be underrated metal albums. And I'll do all of my picks alphabetically, which it starts off with Abigor with their 2007 full-length album, Reactive Possession. Now when it comes to Abigor, they're kind of like one of the most well-respected Austrian black metal bands. When you listen to albums such as Nachthemen, which is considered to be like a black metal classic, a lot of people give them high praise, as their approach seems to be a very suit and tie, diabolical, yet vicious approach to black metal. And ever since the turn of the millennia, they kind of have gotten ignored or either criticized in a negative way, considering the fact that they've gone down more of the experimental route. But recently, with their latest full-length, people seem to show interest with them again, mainly because it's going back to their roots, trying to recapture that Nachthemen sound. So it seems like when it comes to Abigor, all their experimental stuff in the mid-portion of their discography is heavily ignored or often criticized in a negative way. However, with Reactive Possession, I truly feel like this is their most underrated album, because it still captures the vicious nature you would want with Abigor while being experimental. And I get that that's different for fans, but I feel like it still captures it as, yes, it has a more experimental and even more of an industrial approach that's something similar to that, maybe like Thorns or Mysticum, but their edge isn't lost at all. If anything, it's just as good, even to an extent, as like the classic albums like Nachthemen, only the attitude and spirit is in a more industrial manner. Because the drumming, which is something that I think Abigor does phenomenally well, it's not just all blast beats and kind of like simple drum fills. Their drumming has always been very creative and pummeling and just really bombastic, as it's always been. It's still performed top-notch on this album. The guitar riffs are still as killer and diabolical sounding as anything else you would want from Abigor. The performance is just as good. It's just done in a more experimental and industrial way. So for me personally, this is a very underrated album. For my next pick, I chose Enola Throck with their full-length album, Passion. Now when it comes to Enola Throck, they are labeled as an industrial black metal band that combines grindcore together. And when you listen to their early releases, like the Codex Necro and their EP When Fire Rains Down from the Sky, yes, those releases combined all those genres evenly, that it sounds like a whirlwind of chaos that is super barbaric. However, when you listen to Eshkatan, their third full-length album, Onwards, I've noticed that the industrial usage has substantially been diminished in favor of more melody and hooks and groove. And they really maximize that approach to its absolute limits with their full-length album, that being In the Constellation of the Black Widow, which tends to be the fan favorite. However, recently I've noticed as well that they've gained a lot more commercial success ever since they've been signed to Metal Blade Records and released albums like Deseratum and The Whole of the Law. But for me personally, Passion is easily the most experimental and demented sounding Enola Throck has ever been, and really it's the last album they've done that they truly utilize their original sound to its absolute peak, because it's the last time really they've utilized even industrial elements. And because of that, you have songs on here that are just really bombastic and crazy sounding. Songs in here range from 1.5 minutes long, which is their shortest material, to 7.5 minutes long, that being the song, I believe, Drug Fucking Abomination, which is the longest song they ever wrote. They have a lot of guest appearances on here. One of the songs was a guest appearance by Rainer Ladfriman from Bethlehem, out of all people, which is crazy to think about Rainer Ladfriman returning back to vocals for Anaal Nathrakh. The outro track has Maurice doing all of his noise and dark ambient experimentation. Just, for me personally, this is the only Enola Throck album that is meant to be listened to from start to finish. It's not really something you skip between songs. You really have to get immersed in this very demented, disturbed atmosphere that they're trying to create. And I feel like for a lot of people, they want the crazy, chaotic sound of Enola Throck, but they just want to be very straightforward, and all their other material has that, where Passion is just very demented, and they're trying to go for more of an abstract take for their standards, which is why I feel like, for me personally, it's underrated in the sense that it's just so ignored, that it just seems to be the lesser known and least talked about Enola Throck release within the fan base. For my third pick, I chose Autopsy with their fourth full-length album, Shit Fun. Now, when it comes to death metal, within the realms of it, Autopsy will be praised to the moon and back, because when you listen to albums like Severed Survival and Mental Funeral, and even their third full-length album, that being Acts of the Unspeakable, they have an approach that's very vile, grotesque, ugly, and very unwelcoming, that just has this disturbing atmosphere to it that they've made all of their own. And because of that, they're really something of a standout for death metal. Yet when you bring up Shit Fun, a lot of people tend to agree that this is like a huge turning point in quality that they dip down in. And the biggest complaint I notice is that the production value on this album is more thin. It's not as dense and as thick as the previous releases, which, yes, I agree on that aspect, but it's not as bad as people make it out to be in my personal view, because the performance is still as top-notch as anything else you would want within death metal. The vocals are still as grotesque and ugly as anything else within their discography. The guitar solos are just as gnarly as ever, and really stylistically, the only difference I noticed that's kind of subtle, but it is there, it has more of a punk edge to it, especially when you hear the rhythm portions within the guitars, or the drumming as well. There's more of a punk edge. But other than that, this is just as solid as anything else within Autopsy's discography, that I think in terms of negativity, it gets over-criticized way too much, all because of what? Just thin production? Then I chose Black Sabbath with their 1989 full-length Headless Cross, featuring Tony Martin on vocals, which I kind of feel like this is a cheap shot of inclusion, just how easy it is to include this as an underrated album. Because when it comes to Black Sabbath and its fan base, the only two vocalists that seem to ever have existed within this band is either Ozzy or Dio. Everyone else seems to be like non-existent, to the point that they're just often ignored, which is surprising because it's nothing new for Black Sabbath to go through different vocalists, as I believe they've gone through either 8 or 9 different vocalists throughout their discography. But the real big change here stylistically is instrumentally it's a lot more melodic and not as, dark or doom metal influenced as they're often known for. Especially if you're comparing this album to albums like Masters of Reality or Sabotage, this album is night and day from it, because for one, there's a keyboard included that gives off, again, a massive backdrop of melody that people often complain that it really covers up the guitar riffs, that there's really, again, no real doom metal found here. And while, yes, it doesn't have like the true Black Sabbath sound, if that's what you're looking for, however, this is still a very well-written and fun heavy metal album. Again, there's a lot more melody to it. I think Tony Martin's vocals are very soaring and captivates the melodies at all the climaxes you would want. And it's just, again, a very climactic heavy metal album that I can understand the criticisms that it's not the true Black Sabbath sound, but it doesn't take away from the fact that it's just a very well-written heavy metal album. Up next is Darkthrone with their 2001 full-length album, Plague Wielder. And while, yes, Darkthrone are kind of like icons within the realms in terms of Norwegian black metal, that, yeah, they started out as a death metal band with their debut full-length album, Soulside Journey, but immediately transitioned to black metal with albums like Transylvanian Hunger, Under a Funeral Moon, A Blaze in the Northern Sky, and Panzerfaust. And ever since then, fans have kind of held them to this super high degree, hoping that one day they'll return to that raw black metal sound. Yet, Darkthrone has always played around with different styles of music, such as heavy metal, doom metal, and even crust punk. Yet, with Plague Wielder, this is where Darkthrone goes for more of the suit and tie approach to black metal, with elements of traditional heavy metal that, yeah, in terms of pacing, this album's more mid-tempo compared to the faster tempos you would find in previous albums, and it's not as raw. And I feel like the reason why it's so often criticized in a negative way from the fans is that a lot of people look at it like it's Darkthrone trying to recapture their old sound, but failing because it's just not as raw and not as fast. Where I feel like Darkthrone's approach here is they're just going for a very straightforward metal album that, yeah, it's black metal and there's elements of traditional heavy metal. It's more rooted within groove and aggression, and they're just jamming out. And while, yes, the ideas and performance are very minimalistic, it doesn't change the fact that it's still a very ass-kicking album that's just fun. Then I chose Discordance Axis with their sophomore full-length album, Joho. Now, Discordance Axis is a very respected and actually highly influential grindcore band within the realms if you're going for more of the technical approach with grindcore. They're big pioneers for it that, yeah, if you want to blend grindcore and math rock together, Discordance Axis really laid out the blueprints. And the album that seems to be the only thing of theirs that gets any recognition is the last album they ever released, that being The Inalienable Dreamless, which I do understand as to why this album is so loved, because this is where Discordance Axis truly peaked with the technicality aspect within their songwriting. And Joho is often ignored, I've noticed, because the technicality that they're known for within grindcore is absent here. They haven't really made like any, types of influence on math rock just yet. But what this album really is just a very ground and pound approach to a very aggressive grindcore release. John Chain's vocals are just as batshit as any other album that he's been a part in, as he can hit the highs and lows in every which way direction, and just makes, again, this album just so bombastic and crazy. And again, while the riffs don't have the technicality aspect, they're way more raw and just in-your-face sounding, because the aggression is turned up all the way maxed out. So this is more of just their aggressive and angry sounding album, that it doesn't get the recognition because it doesn't have like the standout features. But if you just, again, want a very bombastic grindcore album with just very raw aggression, I strongly recommend this album. I also included Godflesh with their full-length Us and Them. Now, Godflesh, I've talked about them a handful of times already. Huge pioneers within industrial metal. When you listen to albums like Street Cleaner, and even their newest albums seem to have reignited a lot of people's interest within industrial metal and Godflesh as a whole. But within their mid-portion within their discography is Us and Them. that yes, it obviously has elements of a lot of experimentation and industrial, but the standout feature here is that really it's their most complex and upbeat album, because there's a lot of usage of drum samples that has styles of that of drum and bass. It's very schizophrenic sounding. The vocals really kind of scatter around the drum beats and add more of like an echo effect to it. So the drums and vocals kind of play off of each other, but again, it's still a very creative album. It's still Godflesh pushing their sound. That when it comes to the discussion of Godflesh, I've noticed this album has never been brought up, and it's just super underrated for that aspect alone. Then I chose Heavy Load with their debut full-length album, Full Speed at High Level. Now, Heavy Load is often considered to be the first ever heavy metal band formed in Sweden, and they're heavily praised mainly because of their last two albums, that being Death or Glory, their sophomore full-length album, and Stronger Than Evil, their last album. Death or Glory is kind of like their purebred traditional heavy metal album that's super masculine and very epic, that is easily the fan favorite, while Stronger Than Evil has a blend of power metal and thrash metal that's easily their heaviest. So with a lot of metal fans, those are the two albums that get the most amount of attention. Yet with their debut full-length album, I feel like it's ignored because they truly haven't fleshed out their sound just yet. And the big complaint that I can really understand for the most part is that the singing is really rough around the edges. It's not really the best executed, but the riffs and overall performance on the guitars are just top-notch. The solos are great. There's a lot of guitar ballads spread throughout it. And well, yes, there's elements more of like hard rock scattered throughout it, so it's not like that purebred traditional heavy metal sound. Again, everything you would want with a Heavy Load album of that, very masculine and epic guitar riffs are all there. But again, I do understand the vocals and singing is rough around the edges, so make that as you will. But it's a super underrated album that's often overshadowed. I felt like I had to include Judas Priest with their album Turbo. For a lot of fans, this is the worst Judas Priest album that Rob Halford is a part of, because the traditional heavy metal sound that we know them for is not here anymore. For a lot of people, they feel like they sold out because they capitalized on the hair metal sound that was going around during that time period in the mid and late 80s, which they did. It truly is night and day from everything they did a decade previous from it. But while this album may not be their most hard-hitting, I still feel like it's their most fun, because it's very groovy. It's something that you kind of get up to and just dance along with. I mean, again, Turbo Lover, fucking love that song. It's very catchy. It's like kind of meant for like karaoke's for the most part, I feel like, but it's just super groovy. Then you have songs on here like Private Property and Rock You All Around the World that is just infectious. They're like stadium rock songs, yes, but they still have that climactic choruses to them that is what I would want with Judas Priest. Judas Priest has always given off that larger-than-life sound with their performance, and with this album, they've done that, only now it's in the style of hair metal. So, again, I feel like this album's very underrated, and it's often hated by the fan base just solely because it's hair metal in terms of influence, but the fun factor, the style, and the performance you would want with Judas Priest is all there. Second to last pick is Sigh with their 2005 full-length album, Gallows Gallery. Now when it comes to avant-garde black metal, Sigh really pushes the boundary of what you can do within it. If you feel like you've ever came to the point that you fully understood Sigh's approach to black metal, every time they release a new album, it seems like they purposely try to take your understanding of them and just turn it on its head. Like, Sigh is just like as unorthodox as you can get with an extreme metal. And With Gallows Gallery, personally for me, this is easily their most underrated because I feel like personally, this is their best album out of anything they've done. And it's often ignored because people tend to gravitate towards either their debut full album, Scorn Defeat, because it has a bit of notoriety attached with it since Euronymous had a fascination with Sigh during this time period and wanted to sign them to his label, but you know how that all ended. So there's a bit of notoriety with the debut full-length album, which is why it gets traffic. But when it comes to their avant-garde albums, that's all experimental and wild and wacky, people tend to gravitate towards either Imaginary Sonic Scope or I believe it's Insomnophobia are the two albums I notice tend to get the most amount of love. Yet Gallows Gallery is just kind of ignored. I'm not really sure why. Maybe it's just because it's in the middle of their discography and we're just kind of like paying attention to what comes out later. I really can't explain as to why. I mean, some people know it and give it praise, but for me personally, I view it as like this is their best album because it is just such a fucking trip. It is just so wild and wacky and just absurd in the best ways possible, because whenever you think you've figured out what this album is going to do, there's another hook, there's another left turn that just throws you completely off balance, but it's just so engaging and fun. It just sounds like this marching band that's just always changing members within like every minute. All these different instruments that come back and forth with each other that just complements the black metal energy. It is just such, again, a perfect avant-garde album that just needs to be heard. If you really want avant-garde in the most wild and wacky way possible, you gotta listen to this. And the last inclusion, which I'm not going to waste too much time with because I've talked about this band numerous times before on my channel, is Summoning with their debut full-length album, Lugburs. Now, if you're a Summoning fan, you already know what the description is going to be as to why I'm considering this album underrated. But it seems like for the most part, by the Summoning fan base, this album by default is considered to be their worst album, solely because it doesn't have the Summoning sound. This is when Summoning was a traditional and suit and tie black metal band that had a drummer during this time, that being Trifixen, but obviously still had the main members, that being Selenius and Protector, which are kind of like the composers and masterminds of this band. And while yes, I am a diehard Summoning fan and I vastly prefer everything after this album because this is where they would really create their own style of music, blending kind of like neoclassical dark wave in the realms of like Dead Can Dance and obviously their approach to atmospheric black metal. Yes, I vastly prefer everything after this. I've said that numerous times, but it doesn't change the fact that Lugburs is still a very solid and really good atmospheric black metal album. Again, the song on here, The Flight of the Nazgul, I think is still super ass-kicking. It showcases that Summoning, while again, not having standout features, can still make solid material. Yeah, if you're looking for a raw atmospheric black metal album, this album is just as good as anything else you would find on the internet if you're looking for atmospheric black metal. So I think it's just really underrated solely because, again, the fan base tends to hate it. But for the average black metal listener that's just looking for another, solid atmospheric black metal album, this will definitely do the trick for you. And that'll do it for this video, guys. Like always, I'll leave links provided to everything I talked about in the description below, and that is that. So like always, make sure you guys drink plenty of water to stay hydrated, and have a great day.